Hi, this is Joyce Farrell. Let's look at searching an array. Here's an array of ID numbers. Assume these 4 ID numbers are the valid ID numbers in your organization. Here's how they look in memory, one next to the other. Let's set up a subscript set to 0. Let's set up an isValid variable that will indicate whether the ID number that a user is looking for is a valid one or not. And let's set up an ID number for a user to enter. We can prompt the user and then read an ID number from the console. We'll convert it to an integer and assign it to the ID number. Let's assume the user types in 212. We're going to search the array with a while loop. So we're going to test while x is less than the valid ID array length. Well, x has just been initialized to 0 and the valid ID length is 4, so x is less than 4. That's true. And we'll also compare while the ID is not valid ID x, which is right now valid ID 0, which is 125. And that's true. 212 is not 125. So the loop body is entered and x is increased to 1. x1 is still less than the length of the array, and the ID is not valid ID 1. 212 is not 137, so x will increase to 2. Valid ID length is 4, so 2 is still less than 4, and ID number not equal to valid ID 2 is false. So the while loop ends. If x is not the length of the array, and x is 2, and the length of the array is 4, so that's true, it means we found the ID number in the array. In other words, we didn't search through the whole array without making a find. So isValid is set to true. Then we can test if isValid, write that the ID number is valid. And it is, and 212 is a valid ID number. Let's start again. We'll have the user enter an ID number, and this time assume the user enters 213. We'll use the same while loop, and x is less than the length of the array, and the ID number 213 is not equal to valid ID 0, so we'll increase x to 1. X is less than the length of the array. It doesn't match the ID number, so x becomes 2. X is less than the length of the array. It's not the valid ID number, so x is 3. X is less than the length of the array. The ID numbers do not match, and x becomes 4. Now when x is compared to the length of the array, it's no longer true that it's less. So we proceed to the if statement. If x is not equal to the valid ID length, we want to set isValid to true, but x is equal to valid ID length. It's 4, so we're going to leave isValid false. So when we make the test, it's false, it's not isValid, and we'll write 213 is not valid. This code correctly identifies both valid and invalid ID numbers. Thank you for watching.